So in this video we're going to be looking at default values for parameters, and also we're going to look at a shorthand if statement. So for example, let's say that when we create a blog post from the database, so when we're finding something on the database, retrieving it, and then creating an object with the data that comes from the database, that database already has an ID, for example, for the blog post. And that's how we find it, for example. So if we already have an ID for the post, then what we want to do is get the ID and put it inside the self.id variable. That makes sense. But what if we don't already have an ID because we've just created a new post and we want the ID to be self-generating, so we don't have to worry about giving it an ID? And also, what happens if we want the ID to be a really long string with numbers and characters so that the IDs are always unique? Well, we've got to find a way in order so that we can say, if we've already got an ID, use that ID, and if we don't already have an ID, then generate a new one. So the module we're going to be using to generate these unique IDs is called UUID. And we're going to have to import it. And then say UUID.UUID4 open and close bracket .hex. Now let me explain real quick what this is. So UUID is the module when we're importing it up here as well. And that stands for Universally Unique Identifier. And then we're getting UUID4 is the method we're using to generate the UUID. And UUID has a number of ways to generate these. Number 4 is a random UUID. So other UUIDs would take in a value and then generate the identifier from that value by doing a number of things with the value. But in our case, we want to generate it randomly. And then .hex simply gives us a 32-bit hexadecimal string. A 32-character hexadecimal string. So once we've got that, it means that we are always going to be generating a new identifier for a post whenever we create a post. This means that the ID that we pass in the init method is no longer used, but we don't want that. We want to make sure that if we've already got an ID for the post in a database, that we use that ID. So the way to do that is to say, we're going to use this hex value if the ID is none. So use this if the ID is none. I think that's quite readable. And if not, else use ID that we pass here. So UUID4 hex if ID is none, and if not, use ID. These two are the values that we are putting into self.id depending on the condition. This one and this one here. And we will also need a default value for our ID parameter. And what I mean with this is, if we don't give the init method an ID parameter, we want ID to be none. And if we do give it a value, then we want it to be that value. And the way we do that in Python equals none. And now we may choose to not give this parameter a value. And if we don't give it a value, it will default to none. And we could do the same with other values as well. However, we must remember that we cannot do this. We cannot have a parameter with a default value and then parameters without default values and then a parameter with a default value then, or in fact, just that is not allowed. So a non-default parameter follows default parameter is an error. We can only have default parameters at the end. So that would be valid. And now what this will do is if we pass ID a value, we would use that value. And if we don't, we would use UUID4.hex. Okay. So think about whether you'd want to use default value for something else. For example, the date. You could use today's date as a default value. And that would also be fairly simple to do. We would need to use a datetime module that we're going to be looking at in the very next video. So I'll see you there.